All right, so this is going to be the part 2 lecture on global freshwater resources. Now let's talk about another freshwater source, groundwater. So second largest freshwater reservoir at global scale, and in fact it is mostly fueled by precipitation. So precipitation, right, the water that receives on the surface through precipitation, rainfall and snow, what happens with that is actually that infiltrates or percolates through the different soil layers into the groundwater table, into the groundwater reservoir, right? So this percolation or infiltration is actually movement of water through different layers of the soil or through different types of rock formations from the surface towards the groundwater. Now, for this to happen, there should be some sort of a soil pore system that kind of interconnects with each other, or it could also happen through cracks or crevices and cracks of bedrock or other similar stuff. And groundwater, speaking of groundwater, I need you to realize two zones that occur with respect to groundwater in subsurface layers of the soil. First one is zone of aeration. You can actually follow the diagram as I describe this. Zone of aeration is kind of the upper layers of soil that have space in between soil particles, which holds both air as well as water. So as rainwater percolates, as rainwater infiltrates, it moves first through zone of aeration, then ultimately reaches zone of saturation. In zone of saturation, that's actually kind of the lower layers of soil where all soil space is filled up by water. And then what is water table is in fact the topmost layer of the zone of saturation, right? So at zone of saturation, what you see at and below zone of saturation, you are going to start seeing soil water instead of soil air. So soil water table or the water table is not a kind of a permanent mark, right? That it's not a permanent position, right? It changes, it goes up and down seasonally, right? In wet seasons, the water table rises up, moves more towards the surface of the soil. During drier seasons, it actually starts lowering itself. Now, what are aquifers? Aquifers are caverns or kind of underground containers or underground basin-like structures that holds groundwater, right? So these things can actually exist on sand, surrounded by gravel rock beds, by bedrock material, right? And aquifers act like a sponge that kind of draws and collects water that infiltrates through zone of aeration. Um, in aquifers could be connected or could be isolated, could be semi-connected, and groundwater can move at a very slow rate. And in certain cases, certain types of aquifers are actually surrounded by non-porous material like bedrock and clay. So those things actually minimizes infiltration or further movement of groundwater. So let's keep talking about the groundwater a little bit more. First, the difference between confined and unconfined aquifer. An unconfined aquifer overlies a confined aquifer. Unconfined aquifers are on the top, and if you look at the diagram, right, they overlie some sort of a confining bed, some sort of an impervious layer, some sort of an impervious geological formation. It could be a bedrock, right, a parental rock that prevents further infiltration or percolation of water, right? An unconfined aquifer interacts directly with surface water because, as you can see, right, the surface water table is not confined with something else. It directly interacts with the zone of aeration and other upper soil layers. So when water infiltrates and fills up the unconfined aquifer, it generates a pressure, right? And so much pressure that in certain points where the unconfined aquifer reaches or gets closer to the surface, the Earth's surface, the pressurized water discharges to the surface, forming artesian wells. Now, these kind of formations, these kind of artesian wells, are extremely important wildlife habitats because it creates a really unique form of surface water habitats. Okay, this kind of a discharge are frequently happening as springs, or ground, in other words, groundwater springs, or in certain wetlands, or in association with wetland environments. Um, Unconfined aquifers are the ones you find below. Sorry, confined aquifers are the ones that are found beneath unconfined aquifers. So confined meaning restricted, right? So confined aquifers are surrounded by two beds of confining geological layers, right? So these confined aquifers do not frequently discharge to the surface. They do not communicate or interconnect with the surface waters that much frequently. Um, so recharge zones are zones where water, um, can move from the surfaces to the aquifer, right? So that's the point where infiltration can happen. So when you're taking recharge, think about recharging the groundwater reservoirs. Um, Discharge zones are the zones where the groundwater, right, from those aquifers moves back to the surface. Now, this kind of discharge or recharge can happen in anywhere, right? Rivers, lakes, wetlands are example for those. Now, certain wetlands, certain lake beds and river beds can actually have a dual purpose. Some of them in certain times can act as a recharge when there's ample surface water through rain or through precipitation. When it exceeds a certain level, right, um, those riverbeds, lake beds, and wetlands act like a recharge point. And when it's a dry, when the periods are drier, then there's less rainfall, when there's ample pressure building up on the aquifers, the same environments can become a discharge point. Now, what is the impact of changes in the surface land use, land cover on groundwater? Well, certain impervious layers that you create on the surface with urbanization, like paved areas, pavements, parking lots, roads, buildings, all of those actually kind of creates an impervious barrier on the surface. So that actually prevents movements, percolation, infiltration of surface water into the groundwater reservoir. Um, and then the problem is actually what happens with that kind of cutoff of the surface water, groundwater communication. Well, it prevents recharging of both unconfined, or not prevents, minimizes recharging of unconfined and confined aquifers. Well, um, unconfined aquifers will find some point to connect, right? Because they are actually, there's no confinement of them. But if you look at the confined aquifers, since they are naturally confined, the movement of surface water, or the chances of them being recharged are pretty slim naturally, right? If you have more development going on, which cuts off surface water movements into the groundwater, well, actually, confined aquifers will suffer quite a lot. And um, but the downside is, if you look at certain urban environments which doesn't have a large bodies of surface water that are portable, um, the municipalities tends to tap into these deep aquifers. Deep aquifers, those confined aquifers, are actually usually massive, large. They have copious amount of water. So um, the municipalities taps into these kind of reservoirs, right, and extract water. But the problem is it takes forever for those resources to get recharged. As a result, you can reasonably consider deep aquifers as non-renewable natural resources. So those deep aquifers are found also around coastal seabeds. The reason is actually, relates to the historical movements of the geological or tectonic plates, so movement of land masses under low sea level. It's actually those movements that created these confined aquifers, right? And but since those are heavily used, we might be facing loss of certain groundwater reservoirs in the near future, and some of those are already depleted in certain parts of the world. Another source of fresh water is streams, lakes, and wetlands. Um, a very critical source of water, because all of those are also very biologically diverse habitats. Now let's understand what each and every term means. They are not the same, right? I mean, most often in some literature, wetlands are considered type of um, aquatic habitat, but it is actually its own kind. Wetlands are small bodies of water that contains rooted plants, right? Um, Called hydrophytes. You know, those hydrophytes, since they actually are constant in interaction with water, they can tolerate inundations. They can tolerate water saturated soil. Um, and also, wetlands could be um, either have standing water year round or have soil saturation year round, right? Sometimes the presence of standing water or soil saturation could be seasonal, right? So remember that wetlands may not contain standing water year round. Yes, some wetlands do have standing water year round. Certain wetlands may not have standing water at all, where they become wetlands by definition because they have saturated soil, at least seasonally or year round. Saturated soil is soil that is logged with water. Lakes are actually inland depressions that hold standing water, fresh water, year around, and the depths of lakes could range from 1500 meters to more than that, right? The reason why 1500 meters is that if it is less than 1500 meters, you could be looking at a wetland as opposed to a lake, right? If um, the lake's water is not that deep, you also tend to get a lot of rooted vegetation. Then you don't have this open water environment. Lakes are also characterized by open water environments that are very free of vegetation, right? So it's really interesting that fringes of lakes and fringes of streams and rivers could actually be characteristically a wetland. So the examples that I can come up with for the lakes are these the Great Lakes areas, which actually have huge acreages of standing water, right? With where the water depth is way above 1500 meters. Streams, right, are actually flowing water systems, also known as lotic water bodies, LOTIC. Um, and the water sources for streams could be rain-fed, right, through surface runoff or channelized runoff that is coming through precipitation, and in certain cases through groundwater, where certain springs that discharges groundwater kind of makes the stream flow, right? And also glacial flows can also be responsible for stream flow. So certain streams do directly flow from some of one of those water sources to directly to the sea, and some of those actually can end in one of those Great Lake areas or in some other larger lake. Now, I do want you to understand the interplay between these two habitats, right? Wetlands can occur in the fringes of lakes, in the fringes of streams, right? The floodplains of a particular larger river or a stream could have different types of wetlands, and sometimes could even associate certain lake environments, right? Like I mentioned, streams can either flow into a lake or to a wetland. Stream can originate from a particular lake and flow downhill, right? And streams can also originate from wetlands. Right? So these three systems are very much interconnected. That is extremely important in terms of maintaining wildlife habitats. Now, by general knowledge, you might know what a watershed is, right? So watershed is the surface area, the land area that channelizes precipitation to some sort of a lentic or a lotic aquatic habitat. And in other words, you can consider a watershed as the overall surface area along which surface runoff from precipitation, from snowmelt or rainfall, um, is collected, is gathered, and gradually drained through a particular common point. So that particular common point could be a stream, could be a river, could be a creek, could be a lake, could be a reservoir, right? And ultimately, like through those lakes, reservoirs, streams, or creeks, or whatever those aquatic habitats, ultimately, the water will then run into the ocean or a bay or an estuary or similar large receiving point. Um, so the watershed again refers to the land area, right? So the watershed margin is usually could be defined by like a mountain ridge, right? So that's basically what it is. That's what a watershed is, right? And in this diagram, it kind of graphically shows the boundary of the watershed. There are a couple of other terms that can be synonymized with watershed: drainage basin, or river basin, or catchment. Those are all of those means the same thing by definition. And the watershed can be defined in different spatial scales, particularly in terms of managing land areas, managing rivers and lakes. You can kind of administratively define watersheds into different spatial scales, but the ecological definition remains the same. It's a land area or the surface area through which um, surface runoff that coming from rainfall or snowmelt is channelized towards lentic or lotic water bodies. Now, lentic is actually standing water bodies or still water bodies. Lotic is actually running water bodies. So this is more for common knowledge. I want you to think, very specifically about what kind of human activities lead to a global water crisis, right? What specific human activities, right? And I want you to be able to not just mention the activity, but explain how, right? Anyone can mention activities, that leads to imperiled global water resources, but how is the important part, right? How it escalates into an ecological problem, how that ecological problem then translates into a political or socio-economical problem. And I also want you to think about national and international level, and think about where these crises have happened in the US, in North America, or at global scale. I did mention one global scale a couple of times. The Bolivian water crisis is one example, and then I mentioned briefly about what was going on in Italy. Um, so there was a similar crisis that happened a few years back in Spain. I think that problem still is lingering around. Um, so do research into those things on your own time. So now let's talk about transboundary rivers or transboundary river basins. Now, what is a transboundary river? Transboundary river is a river that crisscrosses, that actually flows through multiple countries, right? And in the US, this happens only a few times because we only share borders with Mexico and Canada. For example, if you consider the headwaters of Mississippi, right, is actually lies in Canada. It actually starts from a Canadian lake, right? Um, but if you look at other countries, like other parts of the world, right, in Europe, Danube River kind of interacts with about 20 countries, because the entire river basin, the entire catchment of Danube River drains across 20 countries. If you look at the longest river in the world, Nile River, right, actually the basin of Nile River spans across 10 countries. The same thing, a similar situation regarding other extremely large river basins like Mekong, which is largely Chinese, and Congo, largely Central African, Amazon, largely South American, right? They actually, the entire catchment, or the watershed of those rivers are not just limited to one country. It's really interesting that the benefits of a particular river may be reaped by one country, but in order to sustain those benefits, right, the watershed management becomes a responsibility of more than one country. So this is exactly why conservation of certain global, or conservation of freshwater resources is a global mandate. It's a global responsibility. It should come from global international treaties and conventions. Um, I mean, think about in the United States, right? Mississippi River is a resource, a drinking water source for many municipalities. But conservation of its headwater largely lies within, the Canadians, right? Well, do not misunderstand, right? There's a lots of Rocky Mountain streams that feeds into Mississippi River, right? There are other drainage basins within North America that actually supplies water to the Mississippi River, but where it starts, you can trace its headwaters all the way back to Canadian lakes. Um, so you can also think about this within a particular country too. In large countries like United States, Canada, Russia, Brazil, this actually matters a lot more. There are certain rivers that actually um, crisscrosses between two states, right? If you look at the southern US, most of the state borders are delineated along rivers, which actually is a very poor practice when it comes to managing rivers, right? So rivers should not be treated as a political boundary, right? It's the political boundaries should actually be delineated along the watershed boundary, right? If you do that, the administrative boundaries coincide with the ecological boundaries, right? Like I earlier mentioned, um, a watershed boundary can be traced along the mountain ridge, right? So that watershed is a ecologically meaningful boundary because there are lots of surface scale interactions, groundwater interactions, hydrological interactions, local climatic phenomena happening within the watershed. So watershed itself is a unique ecosystem, right? So the ridge crest that margins the watershed is an ecotone. It's a boundary for that particular ecosystem. But unfortunately, political boundaries never coincide with those ecological boundaries, right? So instead of considering a river as an administrative border, right, river should be considered as the epicenter for the administrative border. So the problem of this current administrative border division is that two neighboring states could manage their water resources, natural resources in completely two different ways, right? Which actually could, like kind of throw the aquatic resources in peril. For example, if you look at certain rivers that is shared between South Carolina and Georgia, right? Um, or South Carolina and North Carolina, right? In South Carolina, you usually have extremely poor uh, rules or regulations regarding management of natural resources, right? But North Carolina or Georgia might have better regulations. So whatever the investments North Carolina or Georgia takes towards managing shared rivers may become a wasted investment if South Carolina does not actually provide the same input, right? You can argue the same thing regarding shared water resources in the southernmost parts of the northeastern U.S. For example, take Chesapeake Bay, right? It's a brackish water resource. It's a brackish water aquatic habitat that is shared between multiple states, right? The proper management of that particular watershed should come as a collective investment of Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, DC, right? But right now, as you can imagine, Delaware, DC, um, and Maryland have actually invested quite a lot on conservation. But before the federal government intervened, the southern states were not very investing. But now Virginia is actually, playing a bigger role in managing that particular habitat. The same thing can be said regarding certain northeastern watershed systems or river drainage basins, like Northern River, right? It's actually one of the least altered river systems in North America, right? The drainage basin is shared between Rhode Island and Massachusetts, right? So the effective management of that particular watershed, right, should be shared between both Rhode Island and Massachusetts. If Massachusetts does not play its role, right, Rhode Island is in peril, right? The same thing regarding Connecticut River Basin. It crisscrosses Connecticut and Massachusetts. And actually, it's not just Massachusetts and Connecticut, right? Particularly because there are so many states in the northeastern part of this part of North America, there are several large river basins. In the Saskatchewan River Basin is another example um, that are shared across multiple states. So when you're managing these resources, policy decisions should be taken between, among administrative boundaries. Taking decision within an administrative boundary will never be effective. It's a loss of resources, loss of money. It's mismanagement. It's not solid, sound management. It's not sustainability. So let's talk a little bit more about the global water use and misuse. So water is in general, it's a renewable water supply, right? And yes, some of the groundwater systems, particularly those deep aquifers, confined aquifers, are less renewable than the unconfined ones. Yeah, but that aside, generally, water is a renewable resource. The surface runoff and then the infiltration of that surface runoff into groundwater aquifers, and the other surface water bodies, those channelized systems, lotic systems, lentic systems altogether, are renewable thanks to the hydrologic cycle. So, about two-thirds of the waters carried in rivers and streams in the world um, annually results in seasonal floods, right? And that particular amount of water is not stored for any future human usage. And during the last century, human population has growth by threefolds, and in response to that, global water withdrawal has increased by sevenfolds, right? And the per head withdrawal has increased by fourfolds, increased 4 times. Now, by to date, in within this decade or so, the water withdrawal is equivalent to 30% of the entire global renewable water supply, right? And unfortunately, most of that increased water withdrawal is due to unsustainable, unwise use of water. It's mostly wasteful. If you look at the two photographs on the bottom, right, on the left, you see this fountain garden, right? How much water is lost through evaporation? How much water just, is lost because this, sprinkler type um, fountains creates water droplets that kind of just keeps adding onto the atmosphere. The water loss is massive in these kind of recreational or aesthetic systems. If you look at the other photograph, it's actually a well manicured home garden. The grasses you see over there, right? And all those flower beds you see around it, those are exotic grasses, exotic flower beds. Those are thirsty crops. Those crops require frequent water supply, and the water supply systems you see in these kind of horticultural landscapes are extremely unsustainable. They don't direct water supply properly to the plants that require it, right? So the supply system is badly designed. The gardening systems are badly designed, right? I mean, why don't we grow some native vegetation in these areas, right? Because native vegetation has an aesthetic value. I think it's heavily underappreciated. Particularly North American native flowers are heavily underappreciated, or maybe unknown to most of the horticulturists. And they have evolved to cope with limited water supply, unlike these exotic um, horticultural vegetation we use. They don't demand so much water, right? The overall footprint is very lower, and the other ecological impacts of those native gardening systems are much lower, right? And there are actually movements towards native rain gardens, native home gardens, um, which actually can be engineered to retain and reuse surface water or rainwater um, for watering these flower beds. But what we have so far, like historically, um, are not very sustainable. Kind of driven more towards excessive water usage and waste. So, in terms of global water usage, if you look at, as I explained, do pay attention to the map on the bottom, which shows the water stress. The red colors indicates very high water stress. Green color indicates um, lower water stress. And the none area doesn't mean that it is stress free, rather you don't have data to elaborate on those points. So certain Middle Eastern or Mediterranean countries like Israel, Libya, and Yemen, the demand for groundwater and surface water has been so high, the rate of extraction exceeds how much can be replenished by hydrological cycle. And this is considered water mining because the withdrawal rate is faster than the renewable rate. That kind of activities are unsustainable, so you have to now seek alternative water sources. Desalination is one of them, right? Israel, Bahrain, and Emirates I have already started and initiated multiple seawater desalination plants. What do you do in what do you mean by desalination? Meaning you extract huge quantities of seawater to pump seawater into treatment plants, then you kind of run something like a deionization, or something like, you know what you do when you make distilled water or deionized water? It's something very similar. So you actually remove all the dissolved salts and ions from water, or retain a minimum amount of minerals, as you find in any drinking water, and remove any other excess salts. That's what simply desalination does. So desalination requires a lot of energy, right? And so its overall ecological footprint is very high. Well, what do you do with the sludge that you generate when you desalinate water? Well, you have to get rid of somehow. Well, most countries dump it back in low-lying coastal environments that actually created this regional high salinity points that will also destroy those low-lying coastal environments. And certain countries dump the salt sludge back to estuaries, back to bays, back to lagoons, or to deltas. That is not a good practice because those lower coastal environments cannot absorb that much high levels of salinity that will kill um, certain wildlife, certain marine life that occupy those environments. Particularly low-lying coastal environments are inhabited by juvenile cages of many marine wildlife that cannot tolerate this much of alterations in coastal water quality. And this has led to many socio-political issues all across the world, particularly in Africa and the Middle East. Um, so if you look at certain high water stress points, Northern Africa and the Mediterranean environment over there, a huge portion of Western Asia, Central Asia, and Middle East, right, and the western part of the United States, right. In 1900s, the water stress on the Western US was much less than what we are experiencing now. So another example at global scale water use, right? Cherrapunji um, is a town located in northeastern India. It was considered among the wettest places on the earth, but today it's actually going dry. Um, so the reason has been that the reason is that this area, that actually received historically over 1400 millimeters of rain is now receiving far less. Within the modern within the last few decades, the average precipitation has been hovering around 10,000 millimeters, and they have been getting more and more droughts, and droughts have been reappearing more frequently in shorter durations, and the length of the drought has also increased. Ultimately, that led to major shortage in drinking water. um, so this is actually a mountain area, like located in northeastern India. The average elevation is over 4,000 feet. So used to receive so much precipitation as a tropical, subtropical mountain ecoregion. So today, there are about over 10,000 inhabitants in this city. Now they actually are now buying water. Earlier, they relied on surface water resources, or other rainwater containment systems, or groundwater for water supply. But now they are losing their surface water resources. So as such, they have to actually buy water, or they have to actually crisscross. People who cannot afford paying for water, they have to travel longer distances, with those huge barrels, and then kind of fill them up and come back to that for just to satisfy their daily water usage. So areas that were actually have an overabundance of water, areas that have never thought they would have a problem with water are now having huge problems with water within the town and within the peripheral areas.